The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla walked toward the private chambers where she kept her most treasured possessions. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ancient walls, each step carrying the weight of secrets that had been buried for decades. Today would be different from all the others. Today, she would finally reveal the truth about the pendant that had haunted her family for generations. The pendant itself was unremarkable to most eyes, a simple silver chain holding what appeared to be an ordinary locket. But those who knew its true history understood that this small piece of jewelry held the power to reshape the very foundation of the British monarchy. Camilla had discovered it hidden among her grandmother's belongings years before she ever met Charles, back when she was still a young woman with dreams of a simple life, far from the complexities of royal duty. Her grandmother, Eleanor Shand, had been a woman of many mysteries. She rarely spoke of her past, especially the years she spent working as a lady's maid in various grand houses across England. But, on her deathbed, Eleanor had pressed the pendant into young Camilla's hands with trembling fingers and whispered words that would change everything. "This belongs to the true heir. Keep it safe until the time is right." For years, Camilla had dismissed these words as the ramblings of a dying woman. The pendant sat forgotten in her jewelry box as she lived her life, married Andrew Parker Bowles, raised her children, and eventually found herself drawn into the orbit of Prince Charles. Even during her most intimate moments with the future king, she never mentioned the pendant or its supposed significance. But everything changed when she became queen consort. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had awakened something within her. She began researching her family's history more deeply, hiring private investigators and genealogists to trace the Shand family line back through the centuries. What they discovered shocked her to her core. The Shand family, it turned out, was not the minor aristocratic line that everyone believed. Through careful documentation and DNA analysis, the investigators uncovered evidence that Eleanor Shand was actually Eleanor Mountbatten, the illegitimate daughter of a Victorian-era prince who had been written out of history to prevent scandal. This made Camilla not just queen by marriage, but potentially queen by blood, with a claim to the throne that predated Charles's own lineage. The pendant, according to the documents they uncovered, had been given to Eleanor by her royal father as proof of her heritage. Inside the locket was a miniature portrait of the prince, and a tiny scroll containing his confession of paternity, written in his own hand and sealed with the royal seal. For over a century, this evidence had remained hidden, passed down through the women of the Shand family, who were sworn to secrecy. Now, as Queen Camilla stood in her private chambers holding the pendant, she faced an impossible choice. Should she reveal the truth and potentially destabilize the monarchy, or should she continue to keep the secret as her grandmother had done? The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She thought of Charles, sleeping peacefully in their shared bed just down the hall. He had waited so long to become king, enduring decades of criticism and public scrutiny. How could she tell him that his wife might have a stronger claim to his throne than he did? How could she explain that their entire marriage might be seen as a political alliance rather than a love story? But there were others who knew. The investigators she had hired were bound by confidentiality agreements, but secrets had a way of spreading in the digital age. Already, she had noticed strange looks from some of the palace staff, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Someone was talking, and it was only a matter of time before the story broke. The royal guard, those elite protectors of the crown, had been acting differently around her lately. Their usual respectful deference had been replaced by something cooler, more watchful. Captain Morrison, the head of her personal security detail, had been asking subtle questions about her family history and her recent research activities. She suspected that someone in the intelligence services had already briefed them on what she had discovered. The irony was not lost on her that the very institution she had married into might now view her as a threat. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to challenges and eliminating potential sources of instability. If they saw her claim as legitimate but dangerous, they would act swiftly to neutralize it. As she stood there, lost in thought, a soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Your Majesty," came the voice of her private secretary, "the Archbishop of Canterbury has arrived for your scheduled meeting." Camilla's heart raced. She had not scheduled any meeting with the Archbishop. This could only mean one thing. Word of her discovery had reached the highest levels of the establishment, and they were moving to contain the situation. She quickly slipped the pendant into a hidden pocket of her dress and composed herself. "I'll be right there," she called back, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. As she walked toward the door, she caught a glimpse of herself in the antique mirror that had belonged to Queen Victoria. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a resemblance to the royal portraits that lined the castle's walls, a resemblance that had nothing to do with her marriage to Charles. The Archbishop was waiting in the blue drawing room, his usually warm demeanor replaced by a grave seriousness that made Camilla's stomach tighten with dread. Beside him stood three men she didn't recognize, but their bearing and the way they positioned themselves around the room made it clear they were security personnel. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop began, his voice formal and distant. "We need to discuss some recent discoveries that have come to our attention. Please, have a seat." Camilla remained standing, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the pendant through the fabric of her dress. "What discoveries might those be, Archbishop?" "I think you know exactly what we're here to discuss," said one of the men, stepping forward. He was tall and imposing, with the kind of face that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "We represent certain interests within the Crown Estate, and we've become aware of your recent genealogical research." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day she first learned the truth about her heritage. The monarchy was a machine designed to preserve itself, and she had become a gear that no longer fit properly. "My family history is my own business," she said finally, lifting her chin with the defiance that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny. "Not when it threatens the stability of the realm," the Archbishop replied sadly. "Camilla, you must understand the position this puts us all in. If what we believe you've discovered is true, it creates a constitutional crisis that could destroy everything we've worked to preserve. And what exactly do you believe I've discovered?" The tall man pulled out a folder and opened it, revealing photographs of documents that Camilla recognized as copies of her grandmother's papers. "We know about Eleanor Mountbatten. We know about the pendant. And we know that you've had DNA testing done to confirm the bloodline." Camilla's composure finally cracked. "How could you possibly know about the DNA testing? That was done privately, through a clinic in Switzerland." "Your Majesty," the Archbishop said gently, "there are very few secrets that can be kept from those who need to know them. The question now is what we do with this knowledge." The weight of the pendant seemed to increase with each passing moment, as if it were pulling her down toward some inevitable fate. She thought of all the women in her family who had carried this burden before her, who had chosen silence over truth to protect themselves and their children. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "We're suggesting," said the tall man, "that for the good of the monarchy and the realm, this information must never see the light of day. The pendant and all related documentation must be surrendered to the Crown, where they can be properly secured." "And if I refuse?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Camilla understood now why the Royal Guard had been watching her so carefully, why the security presence around her had increased in recent weeks. They weren't just protecting her, they were containing her. She walked to the window and looked out at the gardens where tourists were taking photographs, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding inside the castle walls. In a few hours, their guide would point to these very windows and tell them about the queen who lived behind them, the commoner who had become royalty through love and perseverance. They would never know how close they had come to witnessing the end of that fairy tale. The pendant felt like it was burning against her chest, a physical reminder of the choice she had to make. She could surrender it and return to her life as Charles's devoted wife, pretending that she had never learned the truth about her heritage. Or she could fight for what might rightfully be hers, knowing that the battle would destroy everything she had built. As she stood there, weighing her options, Camilla realized that the decision had already been made for her. The men in this room weren't here to negotiate. They were here to ensure her compliance. The only question was whether she would surrender gracefully or force them to take more drastic measures. She turned back to face them, her hand moving once more to touch the pendant. "I need time to consider this." "I'm afraid time is a luxury we don't have," the Archbishop replied. "Word of your research has already begun to spread. We need to act quickly to prevent a media frenzy that could damage the monarchy irreparably." Camilla laughed bitterly. "The monarchy? Always the monarchy. What about the truth? What about justice for my grandmother and all the women who came before her?" "Some truths are too dangerous to tell," the tall man said coldly. "This is one of them." The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was never in doubt. By the end, Camilla had agreed to surrender the pendant and all related documents in exchange for assurances that her family would be protected and that she would be allowed to continue in her role as queen consort, albeit under much closer supervision. As the men prepared to leave, the archbishop approached her one final time. "I want you to know that this brings me no joy," he said quietly. "But sometimes we must sacrifice personal truth for the greater good." Camilla nodded, understanding that she had just participated in the kind of cover-up that had kept the monarchy intact for centuries. Tomorrow, she would wake up and resume her royal duties as if nothing had happened. But she would always know that somewhere in the vaults beneath Windsor Castle, a small silver pendant held proof that history was not always what it seemed to be. The seeds of rebellion, however, had already been planted. As she watched the men leave, Camilla made a silent promise to herself and to her grandmother's memory. This might be the end of one chapter, but it would not be the end of the story. 3 months had passed since Camilla surrendered the pendant to the crown's representatives, but the weight of that decision pressed on her more heavily with each passing day. The official story was that she had willingly handed over a family heirloom for proper historical preservation, but the reality was far more complex. Every morning when she looked in the mirror, she saw not just the queen consort, but a woman who had betrayed her own bloodline for the sake of institutional stability. The palazzo life had resumed its familiar rhythm, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. Charles sensed the shift in his wife's demeanor, though he remained unaware of the true reason behind her recent melancholy. Their private conversations, once filled with warmth and shared laughter, now carried an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could quite identify. "You've been different lately," Charles mentioned one evening as they shared dinner in their private dining room. "Is everything all right, my dear?" Camilla forced a smile, the same practiced expression she had perfected during her years as the other woman in Charles's life. "Just the usual pressures of royal duty. Nothing more than that." But it was much more than that. The covenant of silence she had agreed to was eating away at her sense of self. She had spent her entire adult life fighting for her place beside Charles, enduring decades of public hatred and media scrutiny. Now, when she finally had the chance to claim a position that was rightfully hers by blood, she had been forced to abandon it. The Royal Guard had indeed increased their surveillance, though they did so with subtle professionalism that would be invisible to casual observers. Captain Morrison remained as her head of security, but his team had been quietly expanded. Where once she might have had 2 guards accompanying her to public events, now there were always at least 4. Her private correspondence was being monitored, her phone calls listened to, and her computer activity tracked. More troubling were the restrictions that had been placed on her family research. The genealogists and private investigators she had hired had all been contacted by government representatives and instructed to destroy their findings. The Swiss clinic that had conducted the DNA analysis suddenly claimed that their records had been lost in a computer malfunction. Every thread that might have led back to the truth about Eleanor Mountbatten had been methodically severed. But Camilla was not the same naive young woman who had once believed that love would conquer all. Decades of navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics had taught her patience and cunning. Before surrendering the pendant, she had taken certain precautions that her handlers were not aware of. The most important of these was a safety deposit box in a small bank in Edinburgh, registered under her maiden name and opened years before she became queen consort. Inside that box were photocopies of all the documents related to her grandmother's true identity, along with detailed photographs of the pendant and its contents. She had also arranged for copies to be sent to a trusted friend in Canada, someone completely outside the reach of British intelligence services. Her friend Margaret Chen had been her roommate during a brief period when Camilla had lived in Montreal in her early 20s. They had maintained a correspondence over the decades, and Margaret had no idea about the significance of the documents that had arrived in an unmarked package with instructions not to open them unless she heard a specific code phrase from Camilla. The plan was simple but dangerous. If the Crown's representatives thought they could erase the truth simply by confiscating evidence and intimidating witnesses, they had underestimated the woman they were dealing with. Camilla began to formulate a strategy that would allow her to reveal her true heritage while protecting her family and maintaining her position. The first step was to identify allies within the system who might be sympathetic to her cause. This proved more challenging than expected, as the revelation of her bloodline had apparently reached the highest levels of government and security services. Members of Parliament who had once been friendly to her now maintained a professional distance. Even her own private secretary had been replaced with someone who reported directly to the Prime Minister's office. However, there was one potential ally that the establishment might have overlooked. Professor James Whitfield was a respected historian at Cambridge University who specialized in Victorian-era royal history. He had written several books that were critical of the monarchy's tendency to suppress inconvenient truths, and he had publicly advocated for greater transparency in royal records. Camilla arranged to meet Professor Whitfield at a charity event for literacy programs, a cause that had long been close to her heart. The meeting would appear completely innocent, just the Queen Consort chatting with a distinguished academic about educational initiatives. But their conversation would plant seeds that might eventually grow into something more significant. Professor Whitfield, Camilla said as she approached his table at the charity luncheon, "I've read your work on hidden royal lineages. Fascinating research." The elderly professor stood and bowed slightly. "Your Majesty is too kind. I hope my writings haven't caused too much trouble for the palace." "On the contrary," Camilla replied, choosing her words carefully. "I believe the truth should always be preserved, even when it's inconvenient. History belongs to everyone, not just those in power." Professor Whitfield studied her face intently, as if trying to read between the lines of what she was saying. "Indeed, Your Majesty. I've often wondered what secrets might still be hidden in the royal archives, what stories might never see the light of day." "Perhaps," Camilla said quietly, "the time will come when some of those stories can be told, when the political climate is right for certain revelations." They spoke for only a few more minutes about seemingly innocent topics, but Camilla was confident that her message had been received. Professor Whitfield was exactly the kind of scholar who would be intrigued by the possibility of uncovering suppressed royal history, especially if he thought he had the unofficial blessing of a member of the royal family. The second phase of her plan involved reaching out to investigative journalists, but this required even more caution. The British press was heavily regulated when it came to royal coverage, and any reporter who received leaked information about Camilla's heritage would need to be both brave and well-connected enough to withstand the inevitable legal pressure. Sarah Mills was a veteran journalist who had spent her career exposing government corruption and institutional cover-ups. She worked for a small independent publication that had gained a reputation for fearless reporting, and she had previously written articles that were critical of the monarchy's secrecy. More importantly, she had sources throughout the intelligence services who might be willing to confirm the story if approached correctly. Camilla's challenge was to make contact with Sarah without alerting her surveillance team. This required the kind of tradecraft that she had never imagined needing as a member of the royal family. She began by having her lady-in-waiting arrange a meeting with several journalists to discuss a new royal initiative on women's education. Sarah Mills was included in this group, providing cover for their eventual contact. During the group interview, Camilla managed to slip Sarah a note that contained only a phone number and the words "Eleanor's story." The reference would mean nothing to anyone else, but if Sarah was half the investigator that her reputation suggested, she would eventually piece together the significance. Meanwhile, the pressure from within the royal establishment was intensifying. The Archbishop of Canterbury had requested another private meeting, and Camilla suspected that this would not be as cordial as their previous encounter. The official reason for the meeting was to discuss her upcoming patronage of a new charitable foundation, but she knew that the real purpose was to ensure her continued compliance with the agreement she had made. This time, the meeting took place in Lambeth Palace, the Archbishop's official residence. The choice of venue was significant. It removed Camilla from her home territory and placed her in an environment where the church's authority was paramount. She arrived with her standard security detail, but she noticed that additional personnel were present, including some faces she recognized from her previous confrontation. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop greeted her formally. "Thank you for making time in your busy schedule. I trust the past few months have been peaceful for you." "Quite peaceful, thank you," Camilla replied, settling into the offered chair. "Though I must say, I sometimes feel more watched than protected these days." The Archbishop's expression didn't change, but she caught a slight tightening around his eyes. Security is always a concern when it comes to members of the royal family, particularly in these uncertain times. They discussed the charitable foundation for nearly an hour, but Camilla could sense that this was merely preliminary conversation. The real discussion would come later, when the formal agenda had been exhausted. She was not disappointed. "There is one other matter we should address," the Archbishop said finally. "It has come to our attention that you've been asking questions about historical archives and making contacts with certain academics and journalists." Camilla felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her composure. "I'm always interested in history and education. Surely there's nothing wrong with supporting scholarly research." "Of course not," he agreed smoothly. However, we want to ensure that your interest in history doesn't inadvertently lead to the very problems we worked so hard to prevent. Some stories are better left buried, for the sake of everyone involved. I understand the concern, Camilla said carefully, but I hope you also understand that I can't simply pretend that my family history doesn't exist. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of how hard people try to suppress it. The tall man who had been present at their first meeting stepped forward from his position near the door. Your Majesty, we've been monitoring certain communications that suggest you may not have fully honored our previous agreement. This is disappointing, and it puts us in a very difficult position. Camilla realized that they knew about her safety deposit box, and probably about Margaret as well. The surveillance had been more comprehensive than she had imagined. But, rather than feeling defeated, she felt a surge of anger that strengthened her resolve. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked, her voice sharp with indignation. We're suggesting, the tall man continued, that you've been less than completely honest with us about the extent of the materials you possessed. We've discovered evidence that copies of certain documents may still exist, despite your assurances that everything was turned over to the crown. The archbishop looked genuinely pained by the direction the conversation was taking. Camilla, we're trying to protect you as much as we're protecting the monarchy. If this information becomes public, it won't just threaten the crown. It will destroy your marriage and your position. Charles will be forced to choose between his duty as king and his loyalty to you. That's not a choice any of us want him to have to make. For the first time, Camilla truly understood the full scope of what she was up against. This wasn't just about suppressing historical truth. It was about maintaining the delicate balance of power that kept the entire British establishment functioning. Her claim to the throne, legitimate or not, represented a threat to that balance that could not be tolerated. What do you want from me? She asked quietly. Complete cooperation, the tall man replied. All remaining documents and copies must be recovered and destroyed. All contacts with researchers, academics, and journalists must cease immediately. And you must provide us with the names and locations of anyone who might have received information about your grandmother's true identity. Camilla felt the walls closing in around her. To comply would mean betraying not only her own heritage, but also the people who had helped her in her search for truth. To refuse would mean facing consequences that she could only imagine. I need time to consider this, she said finally. You have 24 hours, the tall man replied. After that, we'll be forced to take measures that will be unpleasant for everyone involved. As Camilla left Lambeth Palace that evening, she knew that she had reached a crossroads. The next day would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of a secret that had been hidden for over a century. The pendant might be gone, but the truth it represented was still alive, and she was the only person left who could decide whether that truth would see the light of day. The game of royal chess had entered its final phase, and Camilla was no longer sure whether she was a player or merely a pawn about to be sacrificed for the greater good of the game itself. The 24 hours that followed her meeting at Lambeth Palace felt like the longest day of Camilla's life. She moved through her scheduled royal duties like an automaton, attending a hospital opening in the morning and a reception for Commonwealth ambassadors in the afternoon. To the outside world, she appeared to be the same composed queen consort who had gracefully accepted her role as Charles's partner. But, inside, her mind was racing through the impossible choices that lay before her. That evening, as she sat in her private study ostensibly reviewing briefing papers for the next day's engagements, Camilla made a decision that would change everything. She would not surrender the remaining evidence of her heritage, nor would she betray the people who had helped her. Instead, she would force the establishment's hand by making the first move herself. Using a secure phone that she had purchased months earlier under a false name, Camilla placed a call to Margaret in Montreal. It was past midnight in London, but early evening in Canada, a time when Margaret would likely be at home and able to speak freely. Margaret, Camilla said when her old friend answered, I need you to listen very carefully. Do you remember the package I sent you last year? There was a pause as Margaret processed the unexpected call. Camilla? Is that really you? You sound different. Yes, it's me. Please, just answer the question about the package. Of course I remember. You said not to open it unless you gave me some sort of code. What's going on? You're frightening me. Camilla took a deep breath. The code phrase is Eleanor's legacy. I need you to open the package immediately and read everything inside. Then, I need you to call the BBC's international desk and ask to speak to their royal correspondent. Tell them you have documentary evidence of a major story involving the British royal family. Margaret's voice rose with concern. Camilla, what have you gotten yourself into? This sounds dangerous. It is dangerous, Camilla admitted. But it's also the only way to ensure that the truth survives. Margaret, I'm trusting you with something that could reshape British history. Will you help me? After a long pause, Margaret agreed. They spoke for a few more minutes, with Camilla providing specific instructions about how to handle the documents and whom to contact. When she ended the call, she felt both terrified and strangely liberated. She had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The next step was to reach out to Professor Whitfield and Sarah Mills. She couldn't risk using any of the palace communication systems, so she would have to make contact in person. This meant evading her security detail, something she had never attempted before in her years as a member of the royal family. The opportunity came the following afternoon during a visit to a women's shelter in East London. These types of engagements typically involved a lot of movement between different rooms and buildings, creating natural moments when security might be slightly less tight. Camilla had studied her schedule carefully and identified a 15-minute window when she would be touring the shelter's kitchen facilities. During the tour, Camilla excused herself to use the restroom, a request that her security team could hardly refuse. But instead of going to the facilities, she slipped out through a service entrance that led to an alley behind the building. She had exactly 10 minutes before her absence would be noticed, and the alarm raised. A taxi was waiting in the alley, driven by someone who had been paid handsomely not to ask questions or remember faces. The driver took her to a small cafe in Camden where Professor Whitfield was waiting, having received a cryptic message earlier that morning asking him to be there at exactly 3:30 p.m. Your Majesty, Professor Whitfield said, rising from his corner table with obvious confusion, I don't understand. How are you here? Where's your security? Professor, Camilla said urgently, sitting across from him. I have about 5 minutes before I need to leave. I'm going to tell you something that will sound incredible, but I need you to listen carefully and remember every word. In those 5 precious minutes, Camilla outlined the basic facts of her grandmother's true identity and the existence of documentation that proved her royal bloodline. She couldn't provide details, but she gave Professor Whitfield enough information to begin his own investigation. Within the next few days, she concluded, evidence of this story will surface through other channels. When it does, I need someone with your credibility and expertise to verify its authenticity. Will you do that for me? Professor Whitfield looked stunned. Your Majesty, if what you're saying is true, this could bring down the monarchy, or it could strengthen it by finally embracing the truth instead of hiding from it, Camilla replied. The choice will ultimately be up to the British people. She left the cafe through a different door and took another taxi back to the women's shelter, arriving just as her security team was beginning to worry about her extended bathroom break. She apologized for the delay, claiming to have felt unwell, and the visit continued without incident. That evening, she received an encrypted message on her secure phone from Margaret Shen. The documents had been delivered to the BBC, and preliminary verification suggested that they were authentic. The story would likely break within 48 hours, depending on how quickly the network's legal team could review the material and confirm its sources. Camilla spent that night staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, knowing that it might be the last time she would sleep in the royal quarters as queen consort. By the end of the week, she could be in exile, divorced from Charles, and stripped of all her titles and privileges. But she could also be recognized as the rightful heir to the British throne, a possibility that seemed both thrilling and terrifying. The first sign that her plan had worked came the next morning when Captain Morrison appeared at her door earlier than usual. His typically composed demeanor was cracked by obvious stress, and he was accompanied by several additional security personnel. Your Majesty, he said formally, I've been instructed to inform you that your schedule for today has been cancelled. You're requested to remain in your quarters until further notice. Requested? Camilla asked, raising an eyebrow. Or ordered? Captain Morrison's uncomfortable expression confirmed her suspicions. She was no longer being protected, she was being detained. The establishment had discovered her activities and was moving to contain the situation before it spiraled out of control. For the next 6 hours, Camilla remained in her rooms while activity buzzed around the palace. She could see increased security presence through her windows, and she noticed that the usual staff members were being replaced by personnel she didn't recognize. Phone calls were being made in hushed voices throughout the corridors, and she caught glimpses of government officials arriving through the palace's private entrances. Charles appeared at her door just after lunch, his face grave with concern and confusion. Camilla, what's happening? I'm being told that there's a security situation involving you, but no one will give me any details. For a moment, Camilla considered telling her husband everything. The truth about her grandmother, the pendant, the cover-up, and her recent actions to expose it all. But she realized that Charles was probably being monitored as well, and anything she told him would immediately be reported to their handlers. I can't explain right now, she said carefully, but I need you to know that everything I've done has been to protect the truth about our family. When the full story comes out, I hope you'll understand. Charles looked bewildered and hurt. What full story? Camilla, you're frightening me. Please, tell me what's going on. Before she could respond, Captain Morrison knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. Your Majesty, he said to Charles, I need to speak with you privately. It's a matter of national security. Charles was led away, and Camilla was left alone to contemplate the gathering storm. She turned on the television in her sitting room and flipped through the news channels, looking for any sign that the BBC story had gone live. So far, there was nothing, but she knew that the network was probably being pressured by the government to delay or kill the story entirely. Her secure phone buzzed with another message from Margaret Chen. The BBC had been contacted by British intelligence services and warned that publishing the story would violate national security laws. However, Margaret had also reached out to several international news organizations, including CNN and The Guardian, and they were moving forward with their own investigations. As the afternoon wore on, more officials arrived at the palace. Camilla recognized the Prime Minister's car pulling through the gates, followed by vehicles carrying representatives from MI5 and MI6. A constitutional crisis was brewing, and she was at the center of it. The confrontation she had been expecting finally came just before dinner. The same group that had met with her months earlier assembled in her sitting room, but this time their demeanor was far less diplomatic. The Archbishop was noticeably absent, replaced by a senior government minister she didn't recognize. Your Majesty, the minister began without preamble, you've placed us in an extremely difficult position. Despite your agreements and assurances, you've actively worked to undermine the security of the realm. This cannot be tolerated. I've done nothing more than try to ensure that the truth about my family's history is preserved, Camilla replied defiantly. If that threatens your version of security, perhaps the problem lies with your system, not with me. The tall man from their previous meetings stepped forward with a folder in his hand. We have evidence of your unauthorized contacts with foreign nationals, your clandestine meetings with potential co-conspirators, and your deliberate efforts to circumvent the agreements you made with this office. These actions constitute treason against the crown. Camilla felt her heart skip a beat. Treason was a charge that carried severe penalties, up to and including life imprisonment. But she had come too far to back down now. Treason, she laughed bitterly. I'm trying to claim my rightful place within the crown, not destroy it. If my bloodline is legitimate, then I'm protecting the monarchy, not betraying it. Your bloodline is irrelevant, the minister replied coldly. The succession is established by law, not by genetics. Even if your claims were valid, they would require parliamentary approval to change the line of succession. What you've done is attempt to destabilize the constitutional order through illegal means. The accusations continued for over an hour, with the officials laying out a detailed case for charges ranging from treason to violation of the Official Secrets Act. But Camilla noticed that they weren't actually arresting her or formally charging her with anything. They were still hoping to negotiate a solution that would keep the scandal from becoming public. What do you want? She asked finally. Complete renunciation of your claims, the minister replied. A public statement that your research was based on forged documents and false information. Full cooperation in discrediting any stories that may have already reached the media, and permanent exile from the United Kingdom. The terms were harsh, but not entirely unexpected. They wanted to portray her as a delusional woman who had been deceived by fake historical documents, removing any credibility from her claims while avoiding the spectacle of a treason trial. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested tonight on charges of treason and sedition. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the penalty could be life in prison. Your children and grandchildren will be stripped of their titles and excluded from any royal events or functions. You'll spend the rest of your life behind bars, watching your family pay the price for your ambitions. Camilla realized that she had underestimated the lengths to which the establishment would go to protect itself. They weren't just threatening her, they were threatening everyone she loved. But even as fear gripped her heart, she found herself thinking of her grandmother Eleanor and all the women before her who had been forced to choose between truth and security. The decision she made in that moment would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of a secret that had been hidden for over a century. As she looked at the faces of the men who held her future in their hands, Camilla prepared to make the most important choice of her life. The silence in Camilla's sitting room stretched for what felt like hours, though in reality only minutes passed as she weighed the impossible choice before her. The government minister and his colleagues waited with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Outside her window, the late afternoon sun was setting over Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal triumphs and tragedies. "I need to speak with my husband before I make any decision," Camilla said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. The minister exchanged glances with the tall man before nodding curtly. "You have 1 hour. But understand that His Majesty has already been briefed on the situation. He knows about your claims and your recent activities." When Charles entered the room 10 minutes later, Camilla could see the weight of knowledge in his eyes. Gone was the confusion and concern he had shown earlier. In its place was a mixture of hurt, disappointment, and something that looked dangerously like betrayal. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble. "Do you really believe you have a stronger claim to my throne than I do?" The question hung between them like a blade. Camilla had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times over the past months, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself struggling for words. "It's not about stronger or weaker claims," she said carefully. "It's about truth. My grandmother was denied her birthright because of politics and prejudice. I owe it to her memory to ensure that her story is told." Charles moved to the window and stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense with emotion. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because it adapts and endures. What you're proposing would destroy everything we've built together. Charles, please try to understand." "Understand what?" He whirled around to face her, his voice rising. "That my wife has been lying to me for months? That she's been working with foreign agents and journalists to undermine my reign before it's barely begun? That she's willing to tear apart our family and our country for the sake of some dusty old documents?" Camilla felt tears threatening, but she forced them back. "Those dusty old documents prove that your wife is royal by blood, not just by marriage. Don't you see what that means? Our union isn't just a love story. It's a healing of old wounds, a reunification of separated bloodlines." "What I see," Charles replied coldly, "is a woman who has allowed ambition to cloud her judgment. The woman I married understood duty and sacrifice. She understood that sometimes personal desires must be set aside for the greater good." The accusation of ambition stung because it contained enough truth to be painful. Camilla couldn't deny that part of her motivation was personal. The chance to claim a position that was rightfully hers, to silence the critics who had always seen her as an unworthy commoner who had stolen the future king from his perfect princess. "You waited 30 years to marry me," she said quietly. 30 years of hiding our love, of being the other woman, of watching you marry someone else. I sacrificed everything for this family, and now that I've discovered I belong here by right as well as by love, you want me to pretend it doesn't matter?" Charles's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "I want you to remember who you are and who we are together. You're my queen consort, the woman I chose to spend my life with. Isn't that enough?" Before Camilla could respond, Captain Morrison knocked and entered. "Your Majesty, the hour is nearly up. The minister is waiting for your decision." Camilla looked at her husband one last time, searching his face for any sign that he might support her choice to fight for the truth. But she saw only the King of England, a man whose first duty was to the crown rather than to the woman he loved. "I understand," she said softly, and Charles nodded with visible relief. But as Charles left the room, Camilla made a decision that would shock everyone involved. She would not accept exile or renounce her claims. Instead, she would force the establishment to show its true face by making them arrest a sitting queen consort for treason. The spectacle would generate international headlines and ensure that her story could never be completely suppressed. When the minister and his colleagues returned, they found Camilla sitting calmly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap like a woman who had accepted her fate. "I've made my decision," she announced. "I will not renounce my claims or cooperate in discrediting the evidence of my grandmother's identity. If you believe I've committed treason, then arrest me." The minister looked genuinely surprised by her defiance. "Your Majesty, I urge you to reconsider. The consequences of this choice will be severe not just for you, but for your entire family. My family has been living with the consequences of suppressed truth for over a century, Camila replied. Perhaps it's time for a different approach. What followed was unlike anything in the modern history of the British monarchy. Within 2 hours, Queen Consort Camilla was formally arrested on charges of treason, sedition, and violation of the Official Secrets Act. The arrest was carried out by senior officials from Scotland Yard's Special Crimes Unit, who treated her with professional courtesy, but also with the gravity appropriate to such serious charges. The news broke on international media outlets before the British government could impose any kind of news blackout. CNN led with the story at the top of their evening broadcast, followed quickly by networks across Europe and North America. The headline that flashed across screens around the world was both shocking and irresistible. British Queen Consort arrested for treason over royal bloodline claims. Margaret Chin had done her job well. The documents that Camilla had sent her months earlier were already in the hands of multiple news organizations, making it impossible for the British government to suppress the story through legal pressure alone. Professor Whitfield had also gone public with his preliminary analysis of the evidence, lending academic credibility to claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as fantasy. The arrest took place at Windsor Castle in the presence of witnesses who included senior palace staff and government officials. Camilla was read her rights by Inspector James Hartwell of Scotland Yard, a veteran officer who had handled sensitive political cases for over 2 decades. Your Majesty, Inspector Hartwell said formally, you are under arrest on suspicion of treason against the Crown, sedition, and violation of the Official Secrets Act. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. As the words were spoken, Camilla felt a strange sense of liberation wash over her. For months, she had been living under the weight of secrets and threats. Now, at least, everything was in the open. The battle for truth could begin in earnest. She was taken from Windsor Castle in an unmarked police vehicle, but word of her arrest had already leaked to the media. Photographers and news crews had gathered at the gates, capturing images of the Queen Consort being driven away under police guard. The photos would be on the front page of every newspaper in the world within hours. The drive to London took place in surreal silence. Camilla sat in the back seat between 2 police officers, watching the familiar countryside pass by her window. She thought of all the times she had traveled this same route in royal convoys, waving to crowds of well-wishers who had finally accepted her as their queen. Now she was making the journey as a prisoner, charged with the highest crime possible against the state she had served. Her destination was not a regular police station, but a secure facility in central London that was used for high-profile political detainees. The building was anonymous from the outside, but inside it was equipped with everything necessary to hold and interrogate individuals whose cases had national security implications. As she was processed through the facility's intake procedures, Camilla maintained her composure and dignity. She answered questions about her personal details and medical history, submitted to fingerprinting and photographs, and was assigned a cell that was comfortable but clearly designed for security rather than luxury. The cell contained a single bed, a desk, a chair, and a small television that was tuned to news channels. For the first time since her arrest, Camilla was able to see how the story was being reported around the world. The coverage was extensive and largely sympathetic, with many commentators noting the historical parallels to other cases of suppressed royal bloodlines. The BBC's royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell, provided analysis that was carefully neutral but clearly suggested that the evidence supporting Camilla's claims was substantial. The documents that have emerged appear to be authentic, he reported, and they raise serious questions about the completeness of the official royal genealogy. If verified, they would indicate that Queen Consort Camilla has a legitimate claim to inclusion in the line of succession that predates her marriage to King Charles. International reaction was swift and varied. Republican politicians in several Commonwealth countries called for immediate investigations into the monarchy's suppression of historical evidence. Monarchist organizations denounced the claims as an attempt to destabilize the crown during a vulnerable period. Constitutional scholars debated whether Camilla's bloodline claims would have any legal standing even if proven true. But, perhaps most significantly, public opinion polls conducted in the hours after the arrest showed surprising support for Camilla's position. Nearly 60% of British respondents said they believed she had a right to make her claims public, regardless of whether those claims were ultimately valid. The percentage was even higher among younger voters, who seemed more interested in transparency than in preserving institutional secrets. As Camila sat in her cell that first night, watching the coverage of her own arrest on television, she realized that she had achieved something unprecedented. For the first time in modern history, the British monarchy was being forced to defend its legitimacy in public rather than behind closed doors. The establishment's attempt to silence her had instead amplified her voice beyond anything she could have accomplished through traditional channels. The real battle was just beginning. Her arrest was only the opening move in a complex legal and political struggle that would determine not only her own fate, but the future direction of the British monarchy. The pendant that had started it all might be locked away in some government vault, but the truth it represented was now spreading across the world like wildfire. Over the following days, Camila would face interrogation by intelligence officers, examination by psychological specialists, and pressure from negotiators hoping to find a face-saving compromise for all parties involved. But she had crossed the point of no return. Whatever happened next, the secret of Eleanor Mountbatten would never again be hidden in darkness. The woman who had once been content to remain in the shadows as Charles's mistress had finally stepped fully into the light, carrying with her the weight of a century's worth of suppressed truth. The establishment that had tried to contain her was about to learn that some secrets, once exposed, could never be buried again. The trial of Queen Consort Camila began 3 months after her arrest, in a specially convened court at the Old Bailey that had been secured and modified to handle a case of such extraordinary constitutional significance. The proceedings were televised live, creating a global audience that exceeded even the viewership for royal weddings and coronations. What had begun as a family secret had become the most watched legal drama in British history. Camila entered the courtroom each day with a dignity that had been refined by decades of public scrutiny, but now carried an additional weight of historical importance. She was no longer just defending herself against criminal charges. She was representing generations of women whose voices had been silenced by institutional power. The pendant that had started her journey might be locked away in government vaults, but its symbolic power grew stronger with each day of testimony. Her legal team, led by renowned barrister Sir Malcolm Thornberry, had spent months preparing a defense that went far beyond the immediate charges. They argued that Camila's actions were not treasonous, but patriotic, an attempt to restore integrity to an institution that had been built on deliberate historical omissions. The evidence they presented painted a picture of systematic suppression that stretched back over a century. The prosecution, led by the Crown's most senior legal representatives, faced an almost impossible task. They needed to prove that Camila had committed treason while avoiding any detailed examination of her bloodline claims, which might lend them credibility. Their strategy was to focus narrowly on her actions, the unauthorized meetings, the leaked documents, the violation of secrecy agreements, while dismissing her motivations as irrelevant to the legal questions at hand. But public attention was focused almost entirely on those motivations. The evidence that Margaret Shun had preserved and distributed internationally had been subjected to rigorous analysis by genealogists, historians, and forensic experts from around the world. The consensus was remarkable in its consistency. The documents appeared to be authentic, and they supported Camila's claims about her grandmother's true identity. Professor Whitfield became the most prominent academic voice supporting Camila's position. His testimony during the trial was devastating to the prosecution's case, as he methodically explained how the evidence fit into known historical patterns of royal legitimacy suppression. This is not the first time, he told the packed courtroom, that inconvenient bloodlines have been erased from official records. What makes this case unique is that the evidence survived long enough to be revealed. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Camila herself took the stand. For hours, she detailed her discovery of her grandmother's true identity, her attempts to work within the system to reveal the truth, and her ultimate decision to go public when faced with demands for permanent silence. "I understand that truth can be inconvenient," she said during her testimony, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "But I also understand that institutions built on lies eventually crumble under the weight of their own deception. I chose to honor my grandmother's memory and my family's legacy, even knowing the personal cost." The prosecutor, Sir Geoffrey Morrison, attempted to portray her as a woman driven by ambition rather than principle. "Is it not true," he asked during cross-examination, "that you saw an opportunity to elevate your status from queen consort to queen in your own right?" Camilla's response became one of the most quoted moments of the trial. "Sir Geoffrey, I have spent my entire adult life being accused of ambition by people who cannot imagine that a woman might act on principle rather than self-interest. I have been queen consort for over 2 years. If ambition were my primary motivation, I would have kept silent and enjoyed the comfortable life that silence would have guaranteed." As the trial progressed, its impact extended far beyond the courtroom. Protests in support of Camilla were held in cities across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, with demonstrators calling for constitutional reforms that would ensure greater transparency in royal genealogy. Counter-demonstrations by monarchist groups argued that stability was more important than historical accuracy, but they were consistently outnumbered by supporters of what had become known as Eleanor's cause. The international implications were equally significant. Republican movements in Australia and Canada used the trial as evidence that the monarchy was fundamentally corrupt and should be abolished. Several Caribbean nations that still recognized the British Crown announced reviews of their constitutional arrangements. The European press presented the trial as evidence of British exceptionalism and institutional arrogance. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of other suppressed bloodlines. Inspired by Camilla's courage, families across the United Kingdom began coming forward with evidence of their own hidden royal connections. Genealogical societies were overwhelmed with requests for research assistance, and archives that had been closed for generations suddenly found themselves under pressure to open their records for public examination. King Charles's position throughout the trial was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire affair. Constitutional requirements prevented him from speaking publicly about his wife's case, but palace sources made it clear that he was deeply torn between his personal loyalty to Camilla and his duty to protect the monarchy. The stress was visible during his public appearances, where his usual warmth was replaced by a strained formality that suggested a man carrying an unbearable burden. The royal guard, meanwhile, found themselves in the impossible position of protecting a king whose wife was on trial for treason against his crown. Captain Morrison, who had supervised Camilla's security for years, was called as a prosecution witness to testify about her suspicious activities in the months before her arrest. His testimony was factual and professional, but observers noted that he seemed uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. As the trial entered its final weeks, it became clear that the outcome would reshape the British constitutional order regardless of the verdict. If Camilla were convicted, it would establish a precedent that challenges to royal genealogy would be treated as crimes against the state. If she were acquitted, it would legitimize public scrutiny of royal bloodlines and potentially open the door to fundamental reforms in how succession was determined. The defense's closing argument, delivered by Sir Malcolm Thornberry, was a masterful synthesis of legal principle and historical analysis. He argued that truth itself was on trial, and that a conviction would send a message that the British legal system valued institutional convenience over factual accuracy. "Members of the jury," he concluded, "you are being asked to convict a woman whose only crime was refusing to participate in a century-old lie. The evidence of her grandmother's royal parentage is overwhelming. The evidence of institutional suppression is undeniable. The only question before you is whether seeking truth in the face of powerful opposition is a crime or a virtue in a democratic society." The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Sir Geoffrey Morrison, focused relentlessly on the legal requirements for treason conviction while avoiding any engagement with the historical evidence. Whatever the truth of the defendant's claims about her ancestry, he argued, her methods were clearly illegal. She violated binding secrecy agreements, leaked classified documents, and conspired with foreign nationals to undermine the security of the realm. The law is clear about such actions, regardless of their motivation. The jury deliberated for 6 days, longer than most observers had expected. During that time, speculation reached fever pitch across British media and social networks. Betting markets showed odds fluctuating wildly as rumors spread about the jury's discussions and possible verdicts. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was packed with representatives from every major news organization in the world. Camilla sat beside her legal team with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the trial, but those who knew her could see the tension in her shoulders and the careful control of her breathing. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict that would reshape British constitutional history. Not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in cheers and gasps, with supporters of Camilla embracing while monarchist observers sat in stunned silence. The jury had not only acquitted her of treason, but had effectively validated her claims about institutional suppression and the legitimacy of seeking truth through public disclosure. But the verdict was only the beginning of the transformation that Camilla's courage had set in motion. Within weeks of her acquittal, Parliament announced a comprehensive review of royal succession laws and genealogical records. The royal archives, closed to public scrutiny for centuries, were ordered to open their holdings to independent historical examination. Most significantly, DNA testing was authorized to verify the bloodlines of all current and potential heirs to the throne. The results, announced 6 months later, confirmed what Camilla had always known. She carried the genetic markers of the House of Windsor through her grandmother's paternal line, giving her a legitimate claim to inclusion in the succession that predated her marriage to Charles. The constitutional crisis that followed was resolved through a historic compromise. Camilla would remain queen consort, but her bloodline would be officially recognized and incorporated into the royal genealogy. Future succession would continue to follow established male preference primogeniture, but the historical record would finally acknowledge the suppressed branches of the royal family tree. Eleanor Shan's story was officially added to the royal historical record, with a formal acknowledgement that she had been denied recognition due to the social prejudices of her era. A memorial garden was established at Windsor Castle in honor of all the forgotten members of royal bloodlines whose stories had been erased from official history. Camilla never again wore the pendant that had started her journey. It remained in government custody as a historical artifact. But she didn't need it anymore. The truth it had protected was now part of the public record, preserved for future generations who would grow up in a monarchy that had finally learned to embrace its complete history rather than hiding from inconvenient truths. The Royal Guard resumed their protective duties with professional dedication, but the relationship between the monarchy and its security apparatus had been fundamentally altered. Never again would they be asked to suppress historical truth in the name of institutional stability. The precedent had been set that some secrets were too important to keep, regardless of their potential for disruption. Years later, historians would mark Camilla's trial as the moment when the British monarchy finally entered the modern era, not through technological adaptation or public relations campaigns, but through the simple revolutionary act of telling the truth about its own past. The pendant might have been locked away, but the legacy of Eleanor Mountbatten lived on in a transformed institution that had learned to find strength in transparency rather than secrecy. Queen Camilla, as she was now properly addressed, had accomplished something that no royal consort in British history had ever achieved. She had changed the monarchy by forcing it to confront its own contradictions. In doing so, she had proven that sometimes the most radical act of all is simply refusing to pretend that lies are truth, regardless of how powerful the institutions that demand such pretense might be.